Hey guys, tonight we're riding straight into the dusty, dangerous, and occasionally downright bizarre world of the Wild West Sheriff. The men who wore the badge, kept the peace, and sometimes caused a little chaos of their own. These weren't just gunfighters. They were politicians, peacekeepers, tax collectors, and on rare occasions, outlaws in disguise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this community stretching across the globe. Whether you're watching in the middle of the night with a cup of coffee or in the afternoon with the blinds half closed. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on the soft hum of a fan or the crackle of a campfire in the background, and let's saddle up together. Picture it, the late 1800s. Main Street is little more than a strip of dirt between weathered wooden buildings. A saloon piano plays in the distance, boots crunch on the boardwalk, and the sheriff walks past with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who knows trouble could come from any corner. His job? Keep the peace, win the next election, collect the county taxes, and maybe, just maybe, survive the week without getting shot at. But out here, nothing is ever that simple. One day he's shaking hands on the courthouse steps. The next he's chasing down horse thieves with a posse of miners and ranch hands. This is the untold story, not the Hollywood fantasy, but the real life of the men who stood between order and chaos in the Wild West. Part 1: Elected by the People. The political side of wearing the badge in the Wild West. Becoming a sheriff wasn't simply about being the fastest gun in town. It was about earning the trust of the people who lived in your county, and that meant politics. Sheriffs were elected officials, chosen through public votes at regular intervals or during special elections. This democratic element meant a sheriff needed two sets of skills: the grit to enforce the law and the charisma to win over voters. Take James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok. In late summer 1869, the people of Ellis County, Kansas, were desperate for law and order. Hickok, already a legendary gunfighter, seemed like the man to tame the chaos. He was elected sheriff, and he certainly got results, but his methods were too aggressive for some. In just a short tenure, he killed at least two men, Bill Mulvey and Samuel Strahan. While some praised him for ridding Hays City of dangerous characters, others saw him as too quick to pull the trigger. When the November election came, Hickok lost to none other than his own deputy, Peter "Rattlesnake" Pete Lanihan. Imagine the blow, being voted out in favor of a man with Rattlesnake in his name. Then there was Bat Masterson, a man with his own brand of charm. In 1877, campaigning for sheriff of Dodge City, he openly asked for votes in the local paper. He promised to serve the people but insisted he wasn't a politician. His straightforward approach worked. In January 1878, he took office and quickly earned a reputation as cool under pressure, decisive, and deadly accurate with a pistol. But the sheriff's role wasn't all shootouts and arrests. On quiet days, sheriffs might find themselves picking up trash on Main Street or dealing with petty disputes. Then, without warning, they could be called into action. One of the most powerful tools in a sheriff's arsenal was the ability to form a posse comitatus, a temporary civilian force deputized to chase criminals or restore order. In the absence of a large police force, this was the sheriff's go-to strategy for big trouble. After 1878, when the federal government barred the military from helping with civilian posses, the role of local citizens became even more vital. These groups could be as famous or infamous as the sheriffs who led them. The Lincoln County Regulators, which included Billy the Kid, clashed violently with Sheriff William Brady's posse during the Lincoln County War, leaving 19 men dead in the Wild West. The badge was more than a symbol of authority. It was a political promise, a public trust, and, at times, a target. The sheriff had to walk a fine line between being tough enough to keep the peace and diplomatic enough to keep the votes. One wrong move could mean losing your job or your life. Part 2: Quiet Streets, Sudden Chaos. The sheriff's daily grind and the power of the posse. If you think a Wild West sheriff's life was a constant string of saloon brawls, dusty street duels, and midnight manhunts, think again. Many days were, in fact, painfully ordinary. The sheriff might spend hours strolling down Main Street, chatting with townsfolk, or, yes, literally picking up trash to keep the place respectable. He was as much a community caretaker as a law enforcer, a familiar face who could settle a dispute over a fence line just as quickly as he could break up a bar fight. But the calm could shatter at any moment. Trouble had a way of riding into town unannounced, often with a six-shooter on its hip. When that happened, the sheriff had a powerful tool at his disposal: the posse comitatus, Latin for the power of the county. It was a temporary force of civilians deputized to help enforce the law. A sheriff could assemble a posse in minutes, grabbing local ranch hands, miners, or shopkeepers, slap a tin star on their chest, hand them a rifle, and ride out in pursuit of justice. This wasn't just a quaint tradition. It was law. And after 1878, when the federal government barred the military from assisting with civilian posses, the practice became even more essential. The sheriff's badge came with the responsibility and the authority to call upon the able-bodied men of the county when the need arose. Sometimes these posses became famous in their own right. Take the Lincoln County Regulators of New Mexico Territory. Among their members was none other than Billy the Kid. They weren't just a bunch of eager volunteers. They were a well-armed, determined force who took part in some of the bloodiest skirmishes of the Lincoln County War in 1878. Their clashes with a rival posse led by Sheriff William Brady left 19 men dead and cemented their place in Wild West lore. A posse could be a sheriff's best weapon, but also his biggest gamble. These were not trained professionals. They were ordinary citizens, sometimes hot-headed and quick to pull a trigger. While the sheriff commanded them under the authority of the law, keeping them disciplined was another matter entirely. And yet, the system worked more often than it failed. In a land where counties could stretch for hundreds of miles and professional lawmen were few, the posse was a lifeline. Without it, many sheriffs would have been hopelessly outnumbered against gangs of horse thieves, stagecoach robbers, or drunken gunfighters on some days. The sheriff's biggest accomplishment was keeping the peace without firing a shot. On others, he'd ride out at dawn with a dozen men at his side, chasing an outlaw trail that disappeared into the horizon. The Wild West was unpredictable, and so was the job. The sheriff's day-to-day life was a constant pendulum swing between boredom and chaos. One moment, sweeping the boardwalk in front of the jailhouse. The next, leading a ragtag army into a shootout that would decide the fate of the town. Part 3: Gun Control in the Wild West. The law before the shootout. Hollywood loves to show the Wild West as a place where every man had a gun strapped to his hip and settled disputes with a quick draw. The truth? Many frontier towns had surprisingly strict gun control laws, and some enforced them with deadly seriousness. Take Tombstone, Arizona Territory in 1881. It wasn't yet a state, but it already had laws on the books requiring visitors to surrender their firearms upon entering town. Guns were to be checked at a hotel, a saloon, or directly with the local lawman. This wasn't a suggestion, it was mandatory. And at the time, that lawman was Town Marshal Virgil Earp. Earp wasn't working alone. To keep the streets safe, he deputized his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, as well as their close friend John Henry Doc Holliday. Together, they enforced the gun ban in a town buzzing with miners, gamblers, and cattlemen, many of whom didn't take kindly to being told to disarm. One October day, the law met its most famous resistance. Cowboys Billy Clanton and brothers Tom and Frank McClory rode into town and refused to hand over their weapons. Tensions boiled. Virgil and his deputies confronted the cowboys near the OK Corral. Harsh words turned into gunfire. When the smoke cleared, Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers lay dead, and the gunfight at the OK Corral became one of the most legendary and misunderstood events in Western history. Tombstone wasn't unique in trying to regulate weapons. Deadwood, South Dakota, Virginia City, Nevada, and Dodge City, Kansas all had ordinances banning the carrying of firearms in town, though the success of enforcement varied. Dodge City went so far as to pass a law in 1874 stating that no person, except law enforcement, could discharge any firearm or even set off firecrackers without the mayor's permission. Why such strict rules in the land of the six-shooter? Simple. Towns didn't want the chaos of armed drunks and feuding cowhands turning Main Street into a shooting gallery. Many were bustling mining or cattle towns, full of transient workers, saloons, and gambling halls. Without regulation, it was all too easy for a drunken card game to end in bloodshed. But these laws created their own tension. Cowboys who spent weeks on the trail bristled at being told to check their guns, seeing it as an insult to their independence. Town lawmen, meanwhile, had to balance upholding the law with not provoking the very people they were trying to police. The image of the Wild West as a guns-everywhere paradise is mostly myth. In reality, many towns worked hard to control firearms, and some of the bloodiest showdowns, like the OK Corral, happened because someone refused to follow those rules. In the Wild West, the badge wasn't just about catching criminals. Sometimes, it was about standing in the street, facing down armed men, and calmly saying, "Hand over your gun." Part 4: Jurisdiction Wars. Sheriffs, marshals, rangers, and the military in the Wild West, the law wasn't one single, unified force. It was a patchwork of different agencies, each with its own authority, and each fiercely protective of its turf. A sheriff might be the top lawman in his county, but that didn't mean he called all the shots. In fact, he often had to work alongside or square off against other lawmen with equally shiny badges. The town marshal was one such figure. Unlike a sheriff, who served an entire county and was usually elected, a town marshal worked within a single town's limits and could be appointed or elected. The famous Wyatt Earp, for example, served as a deputy town marshal in Kansas before his days in Tombstone. His brother, Virgil Earp, was the actual town marshal in Tombstone during the events leading up to the OK Corral. Then there were the U.S. Marshals. Created in 1789, the U.S. Marshal Service handled federal matters, serving warrants, arresting fugitives, and transporting prisoners across state or territorial lines. By the mid and late 1800s, U.S. Marshals and their deputies were constantly on the move, traveling from one dusty settlement to another, often in places with little or no local law enforcement. Sometimes these different branches of law worked together. Other times, they didn't. In one tense example, Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Weidenman arrested several deputies who worked for Sheriff and fellow Deputy Marshal William J. Brady. Brady, in turn, arrested Weidenman. This kind of tit-for-tat was more than a power struggle. It was a reminder that in the West, the law could be as tangled as a barbed wire fence in a windstorm. And beyond civilian lawmen, there were military authorities. On the frontier, the Army had its own enforcement officers who handled crimes within military jurisdiction, particularly in and around forts. In Texas, the Texas Rangers patrolled the border with Mexico and pursued criminals across rugged, unforgiving terrain. The Rangers had a fearsome reputation and often operated independently from local sheriffs, which could lead to tension when their missions overlapped. The overlapping jurisdictions meant a sheriff needed more than just courage and a steady hand with a revolver. He needed political savvy. Stepping on the wrong toes could cause a jurisdictional fight, delay justice, or even lead to open conflict between lawmen. Cooperation could be just as dangerous as rivalry, especially when multiple agencies wanted credit for the same capture. For the average citizen, this web of authority was confusing. Who had the final say? Who could actually arrest someone? The answer depended on the town, the crime, and sometimes which badge got there first. The West may have been lawless in the eyes of the press, but in reality it was crisscrossed with laws, and those laws were enforced by men who didn't always agree. Navigating that system was as much a part of a sheriff's job as chasing down horse thieves. In many ways, the biggest gunfights in the West weren't between lawmen and outlaws, but between lawmen and other lawmen. Part 5: Vigilantes. When posse power turned dangerous in the Wild West, the sheriff's posse was meant to be a temporary extension of the law, a force for order in a land where professional lawmen were scarce. But the line between posse and vigilante mob was razor thin. Under the wrong leadership, or in the heat of local anger, a lawful posse could quickly turn into a rogue outfit that handed out justice without a courtroom. Vigilante groups usually formed in response to crimes that inflamed public outrage, especially property crimes like horse theft, a serious offense in a world where your horse was your transportation, livelihood, and lifeline. Sometimes, they targeted known criminals. Other times, they singled out anyone they believed didn't belong in the community. That could mean drifters, ethnic minorities, or women accused of loose morals. These groups operated under the claim of upholding justice, but without the restraint of legal process. Lynching, public humiliation, and banishment were common punishments. And while many sheriffs saw vigilantes as a threat to due process, others led them point. One of the most notorious cases was Sheriff Henry Plummer of Bannack, Montana. On the surface, Plummer was a respected lawman. In reality, he was the leader of a ruthless gang known as the Innocents. Their name was pure irony. This was a band of thieves, swindlers, and killers who terrorized the local gold mining community. They robbed travelers, extorted miners, and left a trail of bodies across the territory. Eventually, the people of Bannack had enough. They formed their own vigilante committee, a vigilante posse to hunt down the vigilantes. Over the course of their campaign, they captured and executed more than 20 members of the Innocents, including Plummer himself. The sheriff who was supposed to defend the town was hanged by its citizens in January 1864. Stories like this reveal the paradox of the Wild West sheriff's role. On one hand, vigilantes could be an asset, an extra set of eyes and guns in a dangerous situation. On the other, they could ignite chaos and target innocent people. A good sheriff had to know when to let a posse run and when to rein it in. Too much restraint, and the community might accuse you of being soft on crime. Too little, and you risked blood on your hands that no court would condone. It was a delicate balancing act, one that could turn deadly. The very tool meant to strengthen the law could, in the wrong hands, destroy it. In a land without a strong central police force, sheriffs walked a narrow path, trying to harness the will of the people without letting it explode into mob rule. In the Wild West, justice was often fast, loud, and final. But whether it was fair, that was another question entirely. Part 6: Life and Death on the Job. Sheriffs who didn't make it home. Being a sheriff in the Wild West wasn't just stressful, it was often fatal. A badge might grant authority, but it didn't make you bulletproof. The reality was that any day could be your last, and death might come from an outlaw, a drunken gambler, or even someone you thought was a friend. One of the most striking examples is the story of Sheriff Tom Logan of Nye County, Nevada, in 1906. By all accounts, Logan was a quiet, even-tempered man, the kind who didn't swagger down Main Street twirling his revolver for show. He wasn't the type to provoke trouble, but he also wasn't the type to back away when trouble came to him. On the night of his death, Logan was wearing nothing more than his nightshirt when he rushed to the Jewel House, a well-known house of ill fame in a nearby mining town. Inside, a violent argument had broken out between a man named Walter Barrio, a professional gambler, and May Biggs, the madam who ran the place. Logan went in unarmed, relying on his authority and calm demeanor to break it up. But Barrio wasn't in the mood to be reasoned with. He drew his revolver and fired at Logan 5 times. Witnesses later said that even after being hit, Logan wrestled Barrio to the ground, grabbing his hands to keep him from firing again. The sheriff's courage in those final moments was remarkable, but the wounds were too severe. Tom Logan died from his injuries soon after. The local newspaper, The Sun, praised him in its front-page obituary. When the most dangerous men were in the act of committing their misdeeds, Tom Logan was one of the quietest men in the whole camp and always did his duty quietly and well. He would look down the barrel of a loaded gun without a quiver, and he never thought anything of it. A model sheriff, a good citizen, Logan was a man who was a benefit to the world in which he lived. Despite the eyewitness accounts of Barrio's violence, the jury later found him not guilty, ruling that he had acted in self-defense. For many in the community, it was a bitter ending. A lawman had given his life in service, only for his killer to walk free. Logan's death was not unique. The Wild West is filled with similar tales of sheriffs and deputies killed in saloons, on dusty roads, or outside their own homes. In an era with little backup and vast distances between towns, sheriffs often faced danger alone. Every time a sheriff pinned on the badge, he accepted the risk that his next confrontation might be his last. And yet, men kept taking the job. Whether driven by duty, ambition, or sheer stubbornness, they stepped into harm's way, knowing full well they might never step back out. Part 7: Taxes, Corruption, and Outlaw Sheriffs. When most people picture a Wild West sheriff, they think of a lawman chasing bandits or standing firm in a dusty street duel. But there was another, far less glamorous part of the job: collecting taxes. It was a duty inherited from their English predecessors, the Shire Reeves, whose very name gave birth to the word sheriff. In frontier America, this task was just as important as catching criminals, because without taxes, there was no way to pay the sheriff, his deputies, or maintain the jail. Collecting taxes meant visiting ranches, businesses, and sometimes reluctant citizens to get what was owed. In theory, the funds went to local government. In practice, well, temptation was everywhere. The job gave sheriffs both the opportunity and the access to large sums of money. Not every man could resist. Some sheriffs were as crooked as the outlaws they were supposed to be chasing. Take David Updike, the first sheriff of Ada County, Idaho, elected in 1864. On the surface, he was a trusted official. Beneath that, he was allegedly the mastermind of a criminal ring involved in theft, extortion, and murder. Updike's crimes came into sharper focus after the Portneuf Canyon stagecoach robbery in 1865. The attack left 5 people dead and $75,000 in gold missing, a staggering fortune for the time. Evidence suggested Updike had supplied the robbers with weapons. Even more damning, rumors swirled that he had personally profited from the stolen gold. While still in office, he was indicted for embezzling public funds, and the weight of suspicion finally forced him to resign. But resignation wasn't enough to save him. A vigilante group captured him in April 1866, and justice, in the brutal, extra-legal style of the frontier, was swift. Updike was executed by hanging. The stolen gold? It was never found. Updike wasn't the only sheriff with a dark past. Some had been outlaws before taking up the badge. Others committed crimes while wearing it. The frontier's lack of centralized oversight meant that, in many counties, the sheriff was the law and could bend it for personal gain. This duality made the role of sheriff in the Wild West unique. The same badge that symbolized justice could hang on the chest of a hero one day and a criminal the next. For citizens, it was sometimes hard to know whether their sheriff was truly protecting them or lining his own pockets. By the end of the 19th century, as territories became states and law enforcement became more formalized, the wild days of corrupt sheriffs began to fade. But in the era of cattle drives, gold rushes, and boomtown saloons, the office of sheriff was a gamble. You could get a Bat Masterson, cool, decisive, and honest. Or you could get a David Updike, charming enough to win an election, ruthless enough to betray the very people who put him in power. The Wild West sheriff's life was never simple. It was a mix of duty and danger, service and temptation, honor and corruption. And whether they left behind a legend or a scandal, every sheriff's story became part of the untamed history of the American frontier.